In this module, we're going to discuss the theory that hackers will use when attempting to attack your application. And we'll explain why this is the same mentality you need to have in order to defend your application. Let me start by saying that hacker theory probably isn't as exciting as you may have been led to believe by watching TV shows, movies, or things that you may have seen online. Hacker theory involves lots of enumeration and information gathering, well before you attempt to exploit any vulnerabilities that might be found. Let me get on my soapbox for a moment. If you aren't already this paranoid about hackers attacking your application, you probably should be. The landscape of attackers is wider and deeper today than it ever has been, and that problem's only going to get worse over time. 20 years ago, when I first started building web applications, things like jQuery and Prototype.js were brand new, and nobody talked about web application security. Over time, things like the OWASP Top 10 became popular enough that many web application developers might be able to explain things like a cross-site scripting attack or how SQL injection works. But I'm willing to bet that many of you watching this course couldn't dissect some of the more advanced attacks. And that's not a judgment on you or web application developers at large. The truth is that we are typically paid to write code and to build application functionality, not to be experts in the OWASP Top 10 or web application security. Applications today are facing a wide variety of threats and attacks, and there's simply too many for any one person to understand on their own. So let's dive into the life cycle of an attack. Hackers will typically spend the majority of their time gathering intelligence about your application, trying to answer basic questions like what hosting provider is this application living on? Who were the users of the application? What technologies are used in this application? And what's the overall purpose of the application from a business perspective? As the attack matures, a hacker is going to begin developing threat models of the application, trying to figure out what users of any level can or can't do. Once the threat models have been developed, an attacker is going to start looking for vulnerabilities that may exist in the application. These vulnerabilities may be related to process and how a user interacts with the application. It could be vulnerabilities that might exist in APIs, or they may be vulnerabilities based in the technologies chosen to build the application. Finally, an attacker is going to attempt to exploit the vulnerabilities that they've discovered. But as you can see, it's not a truly random set of events for them to get from the start of their attack all the way through the exploitation of vulnerabilities that might exist. Now, this process is more circular than linear, in that as an attacker is walking through your application and they're gathering all of the information, they're noting what threats may or may not exist, and they may stumble into various vulnerabilities along the way. The reality is that the deeper they get into the application, the more often they're going to repeat this cycle over and over. A great analogy of this would be casing your application without any authentication from the start. An attacker is going to try to learn as much as they can without logging into the application, and then hopefully gain access to your application, at which point they are going to enumerate all of the pages that they now have access to as an authenticated user. They may even try to see if pages they could access from an unauthenticated user are different after they have authenticated using a username and password. Now, in the real world, these attacks aren't exactly circular, An attacker may jump between enumeration and finding vulnerabilities, or enumerating and developing a threat model, and maybe they get excited and they try to exploit something along the way. But the point is that there is a defined process for how an attacker is going to gather enough information to find vulnerabilities and then later exploit them. Now, it should also be noted that hackers typically work in teams, especially when you're looking at criminal or nation-state level attackers. They will work in teams because they can cover more ground. They may have experts in web applications working side by side with another attacker who's more of an expert in network security. As you can see, the more people on the team, the more expertise they're going to bring, and the more likely it is that they'll have enough brain power to successfully exploit any vulnerabilities that may exist in your app. So let's be specific. What exactly are attackers looking for when they begin the enumeration phase of an attack? Certainly, they're going to be looking for the company and any employees of that company who were involved in creating the application. They may try to cross-reference some of that information with social media accounts. They're going to be looking for technologies that are being used on the application, whether that be at the server level or on the client. They're going to want to know where the site is being hosted, where the domain is registered, potentially how many servers are involved in the application if there's more than one, the IP addresses involved, etc., and so forth. No information is off limits. The theory in gathering as much information as possible about a target is for the attackers to put together a mental map of what is involved in the architecture of that application. If there are users of the web application, could they be the same users who access the underlying infrastructure hosting the application? At the end of the day, the whole point is to develop a roadmap so that the attackers can plan their attack in a coordinated way. Because if you don't know where you're going, you might end up somewhere you didn't expect. So how do attackers find all of this information through enumeration? There are two basic schools of thought when it comes to enumeration. The first is called active reconnaissance, or active enumeration, and the second would be passive reconnaissance, or passive enumeration. As you'll see in a moment, the differences are really pretty simple. But depending on who you ask, the main differentiator between active and passive enumeration is the idea that you would expose your IP address to the target during active enumeration, whereas in passive enumeration, the target would never know that you were trying to gather information about them. Let's be more specific. In passive reconnaissance, you might be looking for the names and emails of people who work for the company that you are targeting. Maybe you could find some domain registration information, whois data, social media accounts. This is all information that can be found using Google searches or other forms of enumeration that don't involve exposing your IP address directly to the target. On the other hand, active enumeration is going to look directly at the assets of that target. You'll be looking to identify what technologies were used to build the application or website, finding any IP addresses, subdomains, developing word lists, looking for known users of the application, and certainly any vulnerabilities that may exist on that website or web application. Things that you would only know if you were using your web browser to enumerate that target. Now, everything I've just told you is fairly common knowledge in the penetration testing world, active versus passive enumeration. But something I want you to think about as you are learning more about this topic to defend your own applications is the architecture of your application, because this is something that an attacker will be able to reverse engineer with a fair degree of accuracy. By browsing the web application in an active manner, an attacker will be able to find out not only what technologies you chose to build your application, but they'll be able to pinpoint specific versions of frameworks that you may have used to build the application. They'll be able to tell if it's a static website, something that might be hosted in Amazon S3, or if it's more of a dynamic website where every page is rendered on the server in a way that's dependent on the information provided to it. Could it be a single page application written in React or Angular or some other fancy new JavaScript framework? Is it using a content management system like WordPress? These are all very important questions because many of the technologies that you choose to build your application with come with some very strong opinions. For example, if you're using React to build a web application, a single page application that may have multiple views in the browser, you're likely using an opinionated routing mechanism like React Router. And a well-educated attacker will not only be able to tell that you're using React Router, they'll be able to reverse engineer what routes are available to them, whether or not they're linked from the page they land on. If you're using a tool like WordPress to build your website or web application, an attacker is going to know that there's an ecosystem of third-party plugins that are all written in PHP for them to enumerate and further identify vulnerabilities in. There may be various assumptions on where files are stored on the server, the way in which the server interprets the code within those files. Opinions are all over the landscape of web applications, and attackers who are well educated will definitely be able to use those opinions to help reverse engineer a way into your app. Now that we have a pretty good idea of how an attacker is going to approach gathering information and identifying vulnerabilities and potentially exploiting those vulnerabilities, let's start to talk about some specific tools that an attacker may use so that we can use them to identify all of this information on our own and hopefully start developing some threat models. Let's dive into the next module.